the night sky, over Japan, erupted in flames as rockets screamed through the darkness. Launched not from aircraft overhead, but from something the Japanese never imagined possible, a submarine surfaced just offshore. Factory buildings collapsed in thunderous explosions, while rail yards twisted into molten wreckage. For a nation already reeling under relentless B-29 bombing campaigns, this new threat from beneath the waves represented something far more terrifying than anything they had encountered before. The USS Barb had just rewritten the rules of submarine warfare forever, and Commander Eugene B's crew was only getting started. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Pacific Ocean churned restlessly beneath a moonless sky in July 1945 as the USS Barb cut through the dark waters off the Japanese coast. Commander Eugene Bernard Fluckey stood on the bridge, his weathered face illuminated by the faint glow of instrument panels, studying the enemy coastline through his binoculars. At 37 years old, Fluckey had already earned a reputation as one of the most audacious submarine commanders in the United States Navy. But tonight, he was about to attempt something that would shock both enemies and allies alike. The Barb represented the pinnacle of American submarine technology, a Gato-class boat stretching 312 feet in length and capable of diving to depths that would crush lesser vessels. Her hull bore the scars of countless battles, torpedo tube doors that had opened to deliver death to Japanese merchant vessels, and a conning tower that had witnessed more enemy ships sent to the bottom than most submarines would see in their entire service lives. Yet what made the Barb truly unique in July 1945 was not her combat record or her experienced crew, but the unusual modification that had been welded to her forward deck. Where submarine designers had never intended anything more threatening than deck guns to be mounted, Fluckey and his ingenious crew had installed something revolutionary. A 5-inch rocket launcher capable of firing projectiles with devastating accuracy at land-based targets. The modification had required weeks of careful engineering, welding additional supports to the deck while ensuring the launcher could withstand both the stresses of firing and the pressure changes of diving. Navy bureaucrats back in Pearl Harbor had initially balked at the idea, questioning whether such modifications would compromise the submarine's structural integrity or diving capabilities. Fluckey had persisted with typical determination, arguing that conventional submarine tactics were becoming insufficient against an increasingly desperate Japanese defense. Enemy merchant shipping had been nearly eliminated by mid-1945, leaving American submarines with fewer traditional targets but surrounded by heavily fortified coastal installations that could only be engaged effectively by surface bombardment. The rocket launcher represented a quantum leap in submarine versatility, transforming the Barb from a purely maritime hunter into something approaching a mobile artillery platform. The crew had embraced the modification with enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. Chief Petty Officer Ray Carver, a grizzled veteran who had served aboard submarines since before the war began, spent countless hours calibrating the launcher's elevation mechanisms and studying ballistic tables. Carver understood that accurate rocket fire from a moving platform presented challenges that no textbook had ever addressed, requiring intuitive adjustments for wind speed, target distance, and the subtle motion of the submarine, even when surfaced. Lieutenant Commander Robert Williams, the Barb's executive officer, had initially expressed reservations about the rocket launcher project. Williams worried that the modification might compromise their ability to execute emergency dives, potentially trapping them on the surface when enemy aircraft or surface vessels appeared. His concerns were not unfounded. Previous submarines had been lost when caught surfaced by enemy forces, and the addition of deck-mounted equipment could theoretically slow their dive time by crucial seconds. Fluckey had addressed Williams' concerns through exhaustive testing and drilling. The crew practiced emergency dive procedures repeatedly until they could submerge with the rocket launcher secured in record time. More importantly, Fluckey had developed tactical doctrines that emphasized careful reconnaissance and timing, ensuring that rocket attacks would be launched only when intelligence indicated minimal risk of enemy interference. The psychological impact of submarine-launched rocket attacks on Japanese morale had been an unexpected but significant factor in Fluckey's planning. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese civilian populations were already severely demoralized by constant B-29 bombing raids, but those attacks came from predictable directions and followed relatively consistent patterns. Rockets launched from submarines could strike anywhere along Japan's extensive coastline without warning, creating a sense of vulnerability that no coastal fortification could address. Japanese military leaders had spent enormous resources constructing coastal defense systems designed to repel amphibious invasions, massive concrete bunkers housing artillery pieces that could devastate landing craft and supporting naval vessels. However, these fortifications were oriented toward defending against attacks from the sea's surface, not from submerged platforms that could approach undetected and launch rockets before disappearing beneath the waves. The Barb's crew had spent months preparing for their rocket-launching debut, studying coastal target maps and intelligence reports that detailed the locations of critical infrastructure. Fluckey insisted that their first rocket attack should target installations that would maximize both military impact and psychological shock value. Factory complexes that produced aircraft components were ideal targets, combining strategic importance with symbolic significance that would resonate throughout Japanese society. Chief Torpedoman Harold Peterson had worked closely with Carver to develop loading procedures for the rocket launcher that would minimize the submarine's vulnerability while surfaced. Peterson understood that every minute spent on the surface increased their risk exponentially, particularly in waters as heavily patrolled as those surrounding the Japanese home islands. The loading procedures they developed could arm the launcher with a full complement of rockets in less than 3 minutes, a time frame that Fluckey considered acceptable for night operations. The rockets themselves were modified 5-inch projectiles, originally designed for surface ship bombardment, but adapted for submarine launch through careful engineering modifications. Each rocket carried a high-explosive warhead, capable of penetrating reinforced structures and creating devastating secondary explosions in industrial facilities. The psychological impact of rocket attacks would be amplified by their unfamiliarity. Japanese civilians and military personnel had grown accustomed to air raid sirens and the distinctive sound of B-29 engines. But submarine-launched rockets would arrive without warning. Precedent. Navigation in Japanese coastal waters presented challenges that tested even the Barb's experienced crew. The waters were shallow in many areas, filled with underwater obstacles and heavily mined by Japanese forces attempting to prevent submarine infiltration. Chief Navigator Lieutenant James Foster had studied hydrographic charts and intelligence reports for weeks, identifying safe approach routes that would allow the Barb to reach rocket launch positions without triggering underwater mines or running aground on uncharted obstacles. Foster's navigation planning had to account for tidal variations that could expose underwater obstacles or create unpredictable currents capable of throwing rocket trajectories off target. The timing of their attack would need to coincide with optimal tidal conditions, providing sufficient water depth for emergency diving while ensuring stable firing platforms for accurate rocket launch. These calculations required mathematical precision that left no margin for error. Miscalculations could result in the submarine being trapped in shallow water or rockets missing their intended targets entirely. The crew's morale had reached extraordinary levels as they approached their first rocket attack mission. Submarine service attracted men who thrived on innovation and risk-taking, but the rocket launcher represented something unprecedented in naval warfare. Seaman First Class Donald Parker, barely 19 years old and serving his first submarine patrol, wrote in his diary about the excitement of participating in what he called making history that nobody will believe. Parker's enthusiasm was shared throughout the submarine, from experienced chiefs who had served on multiple war patrols to newcomers experiencing their first taste of combat. The rocket launcher had given the crew a sense that they were pushing the boundaries of what submarines could accomplish, transforming their vessel from a conventional warship into something approaching a science fiction weapon. Radio communications with Pearl Harbor had been deliberately minimal as the Barb approached Japanese waters, maintaining radio silence that would prevent enemy intercept stations from tracking their movements. However, Fluckey had received final authorization for the rocket attack mission through encrypted transmissions that confirmed his operational freedom to engage targets of opportunity along the Japanese coast. The authorization had come with explicit instructions to document the rocket attack's effectiveness through photographs and detailed reports that would be analyzed by Navy ordnance experts back in Hawaii. The success or failure of the Barb's rocket launcher experiment would determine whether similar modifications would be installed on other submarines, potentially revolutionizing submarine warfare in the final months of CAS. The Pacific conflict. Weather conditions on the night of their planned attack were nearly perfect, with overcast skies providing concealment from enemy aircraft, while gentle seas ensured stable firing platforms. Fluckey had learned to read weather patterns with the intuition of an experienced seaman, understanding that successful submarine operations depended as much on natural conditions as on tactical planning and crew skill. The target selected for their inaugural rocket attack was a complex of aircraft component factories located near the coastal town of Shari on Hokkaido Island. Intelligence reports indicated that these facilities produced critical components for Japanese fighter aircraft, making them strategically valuable targets whose destruction would impact Japan's ability to defend against continuing Allied air attacks. The factories were also located sufficiently close to the coastline to be within range of submarine-launched rockets, while being far enough inland to surprise Japanese defenders who expected attacks to come from below the air. As the Barb approached the launch position, Fluckey could feel the tension building throughout the submarine. Every crew member understood that they were about to attempt something that had never been done before, launching rockets from a submerged platform against land-based targets. The success of this mission could change submarine warfare forever, while failure could result in the loss of their vessel and the abandonment of innovative tactics that might have shortened the war. Chief Carver made final adjustments to the rocket launcher's elevation and bearing settings, using calculations that had been refined through months of preparation and testing. The launcher's targeting system was necessarily basic, relying on visual sighting and mathematical calculations rather than sophisticated fire control computers available to surface ships. This simplicity was actually an advantage in many ways, reducing the electronic signatures that enemy detection equipment might intercept, while ensuring that the system remained functional even if sophisticated components were damaged by combat or equipment failure. The crew's battle station's assignments for rocket attacks differed significantly from their traditional torpedo attack positions. Men who normally operated sonar equipment or managed torpedo tube loading found themselves assigned to rocket handling duties that required completely different skills and training. This cross-training had been intensive, ensuring that every crew member could contribute effectively to rocket operations regardless of their primary specialty. Lieutenant Williams coordinated the surface procedure that would bring the Barb to the optimal firing position, a delicate operation that required precise navigation while maintaining readiness for emergency IS diving if enemy forces were detected. The submarine's diesel engines would need to operate at minimum power settings to reduce noise and exhaust signatures, while providing sufficient electrical power for the rocket launcher's firing circuits. Sonar operator First Class Michael Rodriguez monitored underwater contacts with extraordinary attention, listening for any indication that Japanese anti-submarine forces might be approaching their B position. Rodriguez had developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between natural ocean sounds and mechanical noises that might indicate enemy activity, a skill that had saved the Barb from detection on previous patrols. The psychological pressure on Rodriguez during rocket attack operations was immense, as his sonar readings would provide the only advance warning of approaching enemy vessels. Unlike traditional torpedo attacks, where the submarine could dive immediately after firing, rocket attacks required extended surface exposure that left the Barb vulnerable to counterattack by enemy surface ships or aircraft. As the Barb reached the predetermined firing position, Fluckey ordered the submarine to surface, beginning a carefully choreographed sequence that would expose them to enemy detection while preparing them for their historic rocket attack. The ballast tanks expelled compressed air with a distinctive hissing sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night air, though Fluckey knew that the sound would not carry far enough to alert enemy listening posts. The submarine's conning tower broke the surface first, followed by the forward section of the hull, where the rocket launcher waited beneath its waterproof covering. Crew members immediately began removing the launcher's protective tarpaulins, while others prepared the rockets for loading, moving with practiced efficiency that minimized their time exposed on deck. The Japanese coastline appeared as a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter night sky, dotted with occasional lights that marked populated areas and industrial installations. Through his binoculars, Fluckey could make out the general outline of their target area, though specific buildings remained invisible in the darkness. The rocket attack would rely heavily on pre-planned coordinates and estimated targeting, as visual confirmation of individual structures was impossible from their firing position. Chief Carver supervised the rocket loading process with meticulous attention to detail, ensuring that each projectile was properly secured and that the firing circuits were functioning correctly. The rockets were heavier than torpedoes and more awkward to handle, requiring special techniques that the crew had developed through extensive practice sessions while submerged in safer waters. The first rocket was loaded into the launcher with careful precision, its high-explosive warhead armed and ready to detonate on impact with the target. Carver double-checked the firing circuit connections and confirmed that the launcher's elevation angle corresponded to his targeting calculations. Adjustments that could mean the difference between a direct hit on critical infrastructure and a harmless explosion in an empty field. Fluckey studied the target area through his binoculars one final time, noting wind direction and estimated range to target while considering factors that might affect rocket trajectory. The distance to their primary target was approximately 4 miles, well within the effective range of their modified 5-inch rockets, but requiring careful compensation for the projectile's ballistic characteristics when fired from a relatively low platform. The moment of firing approached with an almost ceremonial gravity that every crew member could feel. They were about to make naval history, demonstrating that submarines could engage land-based targets with an effectiveness previously reserved for surface ships and aircraft. The implications of successful rocket attacks would extend far beyond their immediate military impact, potentially changing the fundamental nature of submarine warfare. Lieutenant Williams confirmed that all crew members were at their assigned positions and that the submarine was ready for immediate diving if enemy forces were detected. The emergency dive procedure had been rehearsed countless times, but the presence of the rocket launcher and the need to secure it properly before diving added complexity that could prove fatal if not executed perfectly. Rodriguez reported that his sonar contacts remained consistent with normal ocean background noise, indicating that no enemy vessels were approaching their position. The sonar operator's confidence in his equipment and skills would be tested throughout the rocket attack, as his ability to detect approaching threats could determine whether the Barb escaped safely or became another submarine bow lost to enemy action. Fluckey gave the order to commence firing, his voice carrying across the submarine's bridge with calm authority that concealed the historic significance of the moment. The first rocket ignited with a brilliant flash that illuminated the submarine's deck and surrounding water, accelerating B toward the Japanese coastline with a distinctive shrieking sound that would become familiar to enemy forces in the weeks to come. The projectile traced a glowing arc across the night sky, before disappearing into the darkness toward their target area. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes as the crew waited to observe the results of their historic first shot, knowing that the explosion's location and intensity would determine whether their revolutionary weapon system was truly effective against land-based targets. A distant flash appeared on the Japanese coastline, followed seconds later by the rumbling sound of an explosion that carried clearly across the water to the Barb's position. The first submarine-launched rocket in naval history had found its target, though the crew could not immediately determine the extent of damage or whether they had struck their intended industrial facility. Chief Carver immediately began loading the second rocket, while adjusting the launcher's aim based on his observation of the first projectile's impact point. The loading procedure proceeded with mechanical precision, though every crew member remained acutely aware that their extended surface exposure increased their vulnerability with each passing minute. The second rocket launched with identical brilliant flash and shrieking sound, its trajectory slightly adjusted to compensate for wind drift that Carver had observed in the first shot's flight path. The crew's confidence grew with each successful launch, proving that their months of preparation and modification work had created a genuinely effective weapon system. Multiple explosions began appearing along the Japanese coastline as the Barb's rockets found their targets, creating fires that illuminated industrial buildings and revealed the extent of damage being inflicted. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders must have been tremendous, as they suddenly faced attack from a direction they had never anticipated, and against which their existing defenses were useless. Factory buildings erupted in secondary explosions as rocket impacts triggered fires in fuel storage areas and ammunition supplies, creating chain reactions that multiplied the destructive effect of each individual projectile. The industrial complex that had been their primary target was rapidly becoming an inferno whose glow could be seen from miles away, announcing to anyone watching that something unprecedented was happening. Japanese searchlights suddenly began sweeping the offshore waters in desperate attempts to locate the source of the rocket attacks, their beams creating moving patterns of illumination that revealed the enemy's confusion and panic. The searchlights' operators had no experience dealing with submarine-launched attacks and were scanning areas where conventional surface ships might be located, completely missing the low silhouette of the Barb's conning chef tower. Radio intercept equipment aboard the submarine picked up frantic Japanese communications as enemy forces attempted to coordinate a response to the unexpected rocket attack. The intercepted transmissions revealed genuine bewilderment among Japanese military commanders, who were struggling to understand how rockets could be launched from offshore waters without any surface ships being detected by their coastal observation posts. Fluckey ordered the launch of their final rockets in rapid succession, creating a devastating barrage that overwhelmed the target area with high explosive impacts that destroyed any structures that had survived the initial attacks. The rocket launcher had performed flawlessly throughout the engagement, validating the months of engineering work and tactical planning that had made this historic attack possible. The submarine's deck crew immediately began securing the rocket launcher for diving, removing spent shell casings, and covering the equipment with waterproof tarpaulins while preparing for emergency submergence. Every movement was executed with practiced efficiency, though the glow of fires on the Japanese coastline created an surreal backdrop that reminded everyone of the historic nature of what they had just accomplished. Rodriguez reported that his sonar was beginning to detect mechanical sounds that might indicate approaching Japanese patrol vessels, though the contacts were still too distant to present immediate danger. The sonar operator's warning prompted Fluckey to order diving preparations to begin, ensuring that the Barb could escape beneath the waves before enemy forces could locate and engage them. The submarine began its descent beneath the surface, with the same careful precision that had characterized their surface attack. Ballast tanks flooding while the crew secured all equipment and prepared for underwater travel. The rocket launcher disappeared beneath the waves along with the rest of the submarine, leaving no visible evidence of the weapons system that had just revolutionized naval warfare. As the Barb descended to safe cruising depth, the crew could still see the glow of fires through the periscope, evidence of the destruction they had inflicted on Japanese industrial facilities. The success of their rocket attack had exceeded even Fluckey's optimistic expectations, demonstrating that submarines equipped with appropriate weapons could engage land-based targets with devastating effectiveness. The psychological impact of the attack would extend far beyond the immediate physical damage. As Japanese military and civilian leaders struggled to comprehend how American submarines could suddenly strike inland targets from positions that traditional coastal defenses could not engage, the implications for Japanese defensive strategy were staggering, as virtually every coastal installation was now vulnerable to attack by weapons that could approach undetected beneath the waves. Intelligence reports reaching Japanese military headquarters described the rocket attack in terms that revealed the enemy's shock and confusion. Coastal defense commanders reported that their installations had been attacked by unknown weapons launched from unknown platforms, demonstrating that they had no conceptual framework for understanding submarine-launched rocket attacks. The success of the Barb's rocket attack would lead to immediate modifications of other American submarines, as Navy ordnance experts recognized the revolutionary potential of submarine-launched rockets against Japanese coastal targets. However, the Barb's innovations were far from complete, as Commander Fluckey had already begun planning even more audacious operations that would push the boundaries of submarine warfare to previously unimaginable limits. Within days of the rocket attack, Fluckey received authorization to attempt something that no submarine in naval history had ever accomplished: a commando raid against targets on the Japanese mainland itself. The idea of submarine crews conducting land-based military operations violated every conventional doctrine of submarine warfare. But the success of the rocket attack had demonstrated that conventional doctrines were inadequate for the final phase of the Pacific War. The commando raid would require volunteers from the Barb's crew who possessed the skills and courage necessary for land-based combat operations. Unlike naval engagements, where the submarine provided protection and escape capability, the proposed raid would place crew members on Japanese soil, where they would be completely exposed to enemy forces and dependent entirely on their own resources for survival. Lieutenant Junior Grade William Walker volunteered immediately when Fluckey announced the commando raid proposal, despite having no formal training in land-based military operations. Walker understood that the raid represented an opportunity to strike directly at Japanese transportation infrastructure in ways that conventional submarine attacks could never accomplish, potentially disrupting enemy supply lines that were critical for Japan's continued resistance. The target selected for the commando raid was a section of railroad track that carried supply trains between Japanese military installations and industrial centers. Intelligence reports indicated that the railroad carried ammunition, fuel, and equipment that were essential for Japanese defensive operations, making it an ideal target for sabotage operations that could have impacts far beyond the immediate physical damage. Chief Petty Officer Lawrence Anderson also volunteered for the raiding party, bringing extensive mechanical skills that would be essential for placing demolition charges that would destroy railroad tracks and potentially derail passing trains. Anderson had worked with explosives throughout his Navy career and understood the technical requirements for sabotage operations against hardened targets like railroad infrastructure. The planning phase for the commando raid required intelligence gathering that went far beyond traditional submarine reconnaissance. As the crew needed detailed information about Japanese patrol patterns, civilian populations in the target area, and escape routes that would allow the raiding party to return safely to their submarine. This intelligence was gathered through periscope observations, radio intercepts, and consultation with Navy intelligence specialists who had studied Japanese coastal defenses. Seaman First Class Robert Hayes completed the volunteer raiding party, despite being the youngest member of the Barb's crew and having never participated in land-based military operations. Hayes possessed physical fitness and mechanical aptitude that made him ideally suited for the demanding requirements of sabotage operations, while his youth and enthusiasm compensated for his lack of experience in commando tactics. The submarine approached the Japanese coastline under cover of darkness, using navigation techniques that brought them as close to shore as possible without risking detection by enemy coastal patrols. The approach required exceptional seamanship and navigation skills, as the waters near the Japanese mainland were heavily patrolled and filled with underwater obstacles that could trap or damage an unwary submarine. Fluckey studied the landing site through the periscope, noting the terrain features and potential obstacles that the raiding party would encounter during their mission ashore. The selected landing area was a small beach located near the railroad tracks, but far enough from Japanese installations to avoid immediate detection by enemy patrols. The raiding party prepared their equipment with meticulous care, checking demolition charges, timing devices, and personal weapons while reviewing their mission objectives one final time. Each man carried sufficient explosives to destroy a significant section of railroad track, along with backup equipment that would ensure mission success, even if some of their primary charges failed to detonate properly. Rubber boats were prepared for the landing operation, small craft that could transport the raiding party to shore without creating noise or visual signatures that might alert Japanese coastal watchers. The boats were equipped with muffled oars and painted in dark colors that would make them nearly invisible against the nighttime water surface. Weather conditions for the landing were acceptable, with calm seas and overcast skies that would conceal the raiding party's movements while providing sufficient visibility for accurate navigation. Wind direction was favorable for their planned escape route, ensuring that sound from their demolition charges would carry away from Japanese listening posts, rather than alerting enemy forces to their exact location. The submarine surfaced at the predetermined position with the same careful precision that had characterized their rocket attack operations, exposing only enough of the hull to launch the rubber boats while maintaining readiness for immediate diving if enemy forces were detected. The crew worked with practiced efficiency to deploy the raiding party, understanding that every minute spent on the surface increased their vulnerability to enemy detection and attack. Lieutenant Walker led the raiding party toward shore in the lead rubber boat. navigating by compass and visual landmarks, while maintaining communication with the other boats through hand signals that avoided creating noise that might carry to enemy listening posts. The approach to shore required careful timing to avoid Japanese coastal patrols, while ensuring that the raiding party would have sufficient time to complete their mission and return to the submarine before daylight exposed their operations. The small boats reached the Japanese shoreline without detection, sliding onto the beach with barely audible sounds that were masked by natural wave action and wind noise. The raiding party immediately concealed their boats and began moving inland toward the railroad tracks, following predetermined routes that avoided known Japanese installations while minimizing their exposure to civilian populations that might report their presence. Anderson led the technical aspects of the sabotage operation, placing demolition charges at critical points along the railroad tracks, where their detonation would cause maximum damage to both the rails themselves and any trains that might be passing when the explosives activated. The placement of charges required engineering knowledge that ensured complete destruction of the target, while minimizing the risk of premature detonation that might alert Japanese forces. Hayes served as lookout during the charge placement operations, monitoring approaches to their work area while maintaining communication with Walker, who coordinated the overall mission timing. The coordination required precise timing that would allow all demolition charges to be placed and armed before Japanese patrols could discover their activities. The railroad tracks stretched through countryside that showed clear evidence of Japan's wartime desperation. With maintenance deferred and infrastructure showing signs of material shortages that had plagued Japanese industry throughout 1945. The deteriorating condition of Japanese transportation infrastructure would amplify the impact of their sabotage operation, as damaged tracks would be difficult to repair quickly given Japan's limited resources. Walker confirmed that all demolition charges were properly placed and armed, with timing devices set to detonate after the raiding party had sufficient time to return to their submarine and dive to safety. The timing calculations had to account for the party's return journey to the beach, the time required to reach the submarine, and the submarine's diving time, all while ensuring that the explosions would occur soon enough to prevent Japanese engineers from discovering and disarming the charges. The return journey to the beach proceeded without incident, though the raiding party remained alert for Japanese patrols that might have been alerted by their presence ashore. Japanese coastal security had been increased in response to growing Allied submarine activity, but the enemy forces were not specifically trained or equipped to deal with commando raids launched from submarines. The rubber boats were recovered from their concealment and relaunched with the same careful attention to noise discipline that had characterized the initial landing operation. The return trip to the submarine required navigation in complete darkness, while avoiding Japanese patrol vessels that might be operating in the offshore waters. Rodriguez detected the returning raiding party through sonar before they were visible to lookouts on the submarine's bridge, demonstrating the effectiveness of underwater detection equipment even when monitoring small rubber boats. The sonar operator's ability to distinguish between natural ocean sounds and the subtle noise signatures of approaching friendly forces had been developed through months of experience and training. The raiding party reached the submarine safely and was recovered aboard with their equipment and rubber boats, completing the first phase of what would become the most audacious submarine operation of World War II. However, their mission would not be complete until the demolition charges detonated and they could assess the effectiveness of their sabotage operation against Japanese transportation infrastructure. Fluckey ordered the submarine to submerge and withdraw to a safe distance from the Japanese coastline, while maintaining position to observe the results of the demolition charges when they detonated. The timing devices had been set to allow sufficient time for escape, while ensuring that the explosions would occur during hours when supply trains were most likely to be using the targeted railroad tracks. The crew waited with mounting anticipation as the time approached for their demolition charges to activate, knowing that successful destruction of the railroad tracks would represent a completely new form of submarine warfare. The psychological impact on Japanese forces would be tremendous, as they would suddenly face the realization that American submarines could not only attack their coastal installations with rockets, but could also conduct sabotage operations against inland targets. Underwater explosions suddenly rumbled through the ocean as the demolition charges detonated simultaneously. their combined force creating seismic vibrations that could be detected by the submarine's cowl. Sensitive instruments from miles away. The success of the timing devices confirmed that Anderson's technical expertise had been applied effectively to ensure maximum destructive impact against the railroad infrastructure. Periscope observation revealed distant flashes and smoke clouds that marked the location of the demolished railroad tracks, while radio intercepts picked up frantic Japanese communications reporting the destruction of critical transportation infrastructure by unknown saboteurs. The enemy's confusion was evident in their radio traffic, as Japanese military commanders struggled to understand how American forces could conduct sabotage operations deep within their territory. The railroad destruction would have immediate and lasting impacts on Japanese supply operations, as the demolished tracks carried materials that were essential for military installations throughout the region. Repairing the damage would require resources and manpower that Japan could ill afford in the final months of the war, while the knowledge that additional sabotage attacks were possible would force the diversion of significant defensive resources to protect transportation infrastructure. Unknown to the raiding party, their demolition charges had detonated just as a Japanese supply train was approaching the targeted section of track. The locomotive and several freight cars, laden with military supplies, had been derailed and destroyed, creating casualties among Japanese military personnel while eliminating crucial materials that had been destined for coastal defense installations. The train derailment represented an unexpected bonus that multiplied the impact of the sabotage operation far beyond what the raiding party had originally hoped to accomplish. Japanese authorities would eventually realize that American submarine crews had not only destroyed railroad tracks, but had actually caused the destruction of an entire supply train, demonstrating a level of tactical coordination and timing that seemed impossible to achieve from submarine-based operations. News of the successful commando raid spread rapidly through the American submarine force, as other commanders recognized the revolutionary implications of land-based operations launched from submarines. The Barb had demonstrated that submarines could engage in warfare that extended far beyond traditional naval operations, potentially transforming the fundamental nature of submarine tactics and strategic planning. Intelligence analysts studying the Japanese response to the Barb's operations noted increasing evidence of panic and confusion within enemy military commands. Japanese coastal defense strategies had been developed to counter conventional threats from surface ships and aircraft, but submarine-launched rockets and commando raids represented entirely new categories of threat that existing defensive measures could not address effectively. The success of both the rocket attack and the commando raid established Commander Fluckey and the USS Barb as legends within the American submarine service, inspiring other commanders to develop innovative tactics that pushed the boundaries of conventional submarine warfare. However, their achievements also attracted the attention of Japanese forces who began developing countermeasures specifically designed to deal with the new threats posed by American submarine innovations. Japanese naval intelligence began analyzing captured American submarine equipment and interviewing prisoners who might provide information about rocket launcher modifications and commando raid techniques. Enemy forces recognized that they needed to develop new defensive strategies quickly if they were to prevent additional attacks by submarines equipped with land attack capabilities. The psychological impact of the Barb's operations extended throughout Japanese society, as civilian populations realized that American forces possessed capabilities that made virtually any coastal target vulnerable to attack without warning. The knowledge that submarines could strike inland targets with rockets or conduct sabotage operations created a sense of helplessness that undermined Japanese civilian morale during the final months of the war. Strategic analysts within the Japanese military began recommending the relocation of critical industrial facilities away from coastal areas, though Japan's geography made such relocations extremely difficult and resource-intensive. The recommendation revealed the extent to which American submarine innovations had disrupted Japanese strategic planning and forced fundamental reconsiderations of defensive strategy. The Barb's crew celebrated their historic achievements with the quiet satisfaction of professionals who had accomplished something unprecedented in naval warfare. However, They remained fully aware that their innovations had made them priority targets for Japanese forces, who would undoubtedly seek revenge for the humiliation of being attacked by submarine-launched weapons. And commando raids. Commander Fluckey began planning additional operations that would build upon the success of their rocket attacks and sabotage missions. Recognizing that the element of surprise would diminish as Japanese forces adapted to deal with submarine-launched threats, future operations would need to incorporate new tactics and target selection criteria that maintain the effectiveness of submarine-based land attack capabilities. The final months of World War II would see additional submarine rocket attacks and commando raids as other American submarines adopted the tactics pioneered by the USS Barb. Though none would achieve the historic significance of being the first to demonstrate these revolutionary capabilities, the Barb had fundamentally changed submarine warfare forever, proving that underwater vessels could engage in land-based operations with devastating effectiveness. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the USS Barb had established herself as the most innovative and successful submarine of the Pacific War. Her rocket attacks and commando raids had demonstrated American ingenuity and determination, while contributing to the psychological pressure that ultimately convinced Japanese leaders that continued resistance was futile. The legacy of the USS Barb's innovations would influence submarine design and tactics for decades after the war ended. As naval architects and tactical planners incorporated lessons learned from rocket attacks and commando operations into future submarine development programs, the boat had proven that submarines could serve roles far beyond traditional naval warfare, opening possibilities that would reshape military thinking about underwater operations. Commander Eugene Fluckey would receive the Medal of Honor for his leadership during the Barb's innovative operations. Recognition that acknowledged not only his personal courage, but also his visionary approach to submarine warfare that had revolutionized naval tactics. His crew shared in the recognition, understanding that their collective efforts had created military capabilities that no enemy had anticipated or prepared to counter. The Japanese coastal installations that had been targeted by the Barb's rocket attacks remained damaged when the war ended, serving as permanent reminders of American technological superiority and tactical prowess. Innovation. The psychological impact of those attacks had contributed to Japanese recognition that their defensive strategies were inadequate against American military capabilities that seemed to grow more sophisticated and deadly with each passing month. Historians would later recognize the USS Barb's operations as pivotal moments in the development of modern military tactics, demonstrating principles of innovation and adaptation that would influence military thinking far beyond submarine warfare. The boat had shown that conventional limitations could be overcome through creative engineering and bold tactical thinking, lessons that would prove valuable in future conflicts requiring unconventional approaches to military challenges. The story of the USS Barb firing rockets from her submarine deck and conducting the only submarine-launched commando raid in American naval history represents the pinnacle of innovation and courage. During World War II, Commander Fluckey and his crew had shocked Japan and amazed their own navy by proving that submarines could wage war in ways that no one had previously imagined possible, forever changing the nature of underwater warfare and establishing legends that would inspire future generations of submarine crews. The immediate aftermath of the railroad sabotage operation revealed the true extent of the destruction that the raiding party had accomplished. Japanese military reports, intercepted by American intelligence, described the complete destruction of not only the railroad tracks, but also a massive supply train that had been carrying ammunition, fuel, and critical components for aircraft production. The timing of the demolition charges had been so precise that the locomotive had been traveling at full speed when the explosion occurred, creating a catastrophic derailment that scattered military supplies across several miles of countryside. Chief Petty Officer Anderson studied the intercepted reports with professional satisfaction, recognizing that his careful placement of demolition charges had achieved results beyond their most optimistic expectations. The destruction of the supply train represented a significant blow to Japanese military logistics, as the materials on board had been irreplaceable given Japan's desperate resource shortages in the final months. of the war. Lieutenant Walker felt a profound sense of accomplishment as intelligence analysts confirmed that their sabotage operation had exceeded all projected damage estimates. The successful completion of the first submarine-launched commando raid in naval history had validated months of training and preparation while demonstrating that American submarines could extend their operational capabilities far beyond traditional maritime warfare. Seaman Hayes wrote extensively in his personal diary about the experience of conducting land-based military operations from a submarine platform, describing the surreal sensation of walking on Japanese soil while knowing that their escape route lay beneath the waves miles offshore. His writings would later provide historians with detailed insights into the psychological challenges faced by submarine crews who volunteered for commando operations that placed them completely outside their normal operational environment. The success of both the rocket attack and the commando raid prompted immediate requests from other submarine commanders who wanted to implement similar modifications and tactics aboard their own vessels. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Pacific Submarine Forces, recognized the revolutionary potential of submarine-launched land attacks and authorized the rapid modification of additional submarines with rocket launchers and commando capabilities. However, the implementation of rocket launcher modifications on other submarines proved more challenging than initially anticipated. The Barb's rocket launcher had been designed and installed through months of careful engineering work that took advantage of specific structural characteristics unique to that particular submarine. Other vessels required different mounting systems and structural reinforcements that delayed the deployment of additional rocket-equipped submarines. Engineering teams at Pearl Harbor worked frantically to develop standardized rocket launcher systems that could be installed on various submarine classes without compromising their diving capabilities or structural integrity. The engineers faced complex challenges in creating mounting systems that could withstand both the stresses of rocket firing and the pressure changes associated with diving to operational depths. Chief Carver became a consultant for these engineering efforts, sharing his practical experience with rocket launcher operations while helping to develop training programs for crews who would operate the new CRAD weapon systems. His expertise proved invaluable in identifying potential problems and developing solutions based on real-world operational experience rather than theoretical calculations. The psychological warfare aspects of submarine-launched rocket attacks began receiving increased attention from American military planners, who recognized that the terror effect on Japanese civilian populations might be as valuable as the physical destruction of industrial targets. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese morale was already severely damaged by constant B-29 bombing raids. But rocket attacks from submarines created a new dimension of vulnerability that existing air raid shelters and civil defense measures could not address. Japanese military leaders struggled to develop effective countermeasures against submarine-launched rocket attacks. As their coastal defense systems had been designed to engage surface vessels and aircraft, rather than submerged platforms that could approach undetected. The mobility of submarines made it impossible to predict where attacks might occur, forcing Japanese forces to spread their defensive resources thinly across thousands of miles of coastline. Radar systems that had been effective against surface ships and aircraft proved inadequate for detecting submarines that remained submerged until the moment of attack. Even the most sophisticated Japanese radar installations could not track submarines approaching underwater, leaving coastal defense forces blind to threats until rockets were already being launched against their positions. The development of new tactics for submarine rocket attacks continued aboard the Barb, as Commander Fluckey and his crew refined their procedures based on lessons learned from their initial operations. They discovered that multiple rocket attacks against the same general area could create cascading effects as secondary explosions and fires spread beyond the immediate target zones, multiplying the destructive impact of individual rockets. Targeting selection became increasingly sophisticated as intelligence officers provided detailed analysis of Japanese industrial installations and their vulnerability to rocket attack. Chemical plants proved particularly susceptible to rocket-induced fires, as stored chemicals created massive secondary explosions that could destroy entire industrial complexes with relatively few direct hits. Railroad marshalling yards emerged as ideal targets for rocket attacks, as the destruction of switching equipment and signal systems could paralyze transportation networks far beyond the immediate area of impact. A successful rocket attack against a major railroad junction could disrupt supply lines throughout an entire region, creating logistical problems that persisted long after the physical damage had been repaired. The crew of the USS Barb developed an almost supernatural confidence in their ability to strike targets that had previously been considered invulnerable to submarine attack. This confidence translated into increasingly bold operational planning as they sought targets deeper inland and more heavily defended than their initial objectives. Fuel storage facilities became priority targets for rocket attacks, as their destruction created spectacular fires that could be seen for miles, while eliminating critical resources the Japanese military forces needed for defensive operations. The psychological impact of burning fuel depots was enormous, as the massive fires announced to civilian populations that American forces could strike anywhere along the Japanese coastline. Aircraft manufacturing facilities represented the most strategically valuable targets for rocket attacks, as their destruction directly impacted Japan's ability to produce fighters and bombers needed to defend against continuing Allied air raids. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese aircraft production had already been severely disrupted by B-29 attacks. But rocket strikes against component manufacturing plants created additional bottlenecks that further reduced enemy aircraft availability. The technical challenges of conducting precision rocket attacks from submarine platforms led to innovations in targeting systems and firing procedures that would influence naval gunnery for decades after the war ended. The crew developed techniques for compensating for submarine motion and environmental factors that affected rocket trajectory, creating methods that were later incorporated into standard Navy gunnery training programs. Weather considerations became increasingly important as the crew gained experience with rocket attacks under various conditions. Wind speed and direction significantly affected rocket accuracy, while sea states influenced the stability of the firing platform and the precision of targeting calculations. The crew learned to time their attacks to coincide with optimal weather conditions that maximized their chances of achieving direct hits on priority targets. Night attacks proved most effective for avoiding enemy detection, but darkness also complicated targeting and damage assessment procedures. The crew developed techniques for using landmark illumination and celestial navigation to improve targeting accuracy during nighttime rocket attacks, while post-attack reconnaissance through periscope observation helped assess the effectiveness of their strikes. Japanese forces began implementing new patrol patterns and coastal surveillance procedures in desperate attempts to counter the submarine rocket threat. But their efforts were largely ineffective due to the mobility and stealth characteristics of American submarines. Increased surface patrols actually made Japanese forces more vulnerable to torpedo attacks, as patrol vessels presented attractive targets for submarines that had completed their rocket missions. The strategic impact of submarine rocket attacks extended far beyond their immediate military effectiveness. As Japanese industrial planners began relocating critical facilities away from coastal areas in expensive and time-consuming efforts to reduce their vulnerability. These relocations required resources and transportation capacity that Japan could ill afford in the final months of the war, while the inland facilities were often less efficient than their coastal predecessors. Civilian evacuation from coastal areas increased dramatically as Japanese authorities acknowledged that they could not provide effective protection against submarine-launched rocket attacks. These evacuations disrupted industrial production and created refugee problems that strained Japan's already overtaxed social services, contributing to the general deterioration of Japanese society during the final phase of the war. The success of the Barb's innovations inspired similar creativity among other American submarine commanders, who began developing their own modifications and tactical innovations. Some submarines experimented with different rocket types and mounting systems, while others focused on improving the effectiveness of commando operations through enhanced training and equipment modifications. Lieutenant Commander Robert Williams played a crucial role in documenting the technical aspects of rocket launcher operations and commando raid procedures, creating detailed manuals that could be used to train crews on other submarines. His documentation efforts ensured that the Barb's innovations could be rapidly replicated throughout the Pacific Submarine Force. multiplying their strategic impact. The crew's expertise in underwater demolitions expanded beyond railroad sabotage to include attacks against harbor facilities, coastal bridges, and communication installations that supported Japanese crime. Military operations. Each successful commando raid provided valuable experience that improved the planning and execution of subsequent operations, while demonstrating the versatility of submarine-launched land warfare capabilities. Harbor installations proved particularly vulnerable to commando attacks, as submarine crews could approach underwater and surface directly within harbor areas that were considered secure by Japanese defenders. The destruction of harbor cranes, fuel storage tanks, and loading facilities could paralyze entire ports for weeks or months, disrupting supply operations that were critical for Japanese military effectiveness. Communication facilities became priority targets for commando raids, as their destruction could blind Japanese military commanders and prevent coordinated responses to Allied attacks. Telephone exchanges, radio stations, and telegraph facilities were often located near coastal areas, where they were accessible to submarine-launched raiding parties, who could destroy equipment and eliminate personnel responsible for military communications. The psychological pressure on Japanese coastal defense forces increased dramatically as submarine rocket attacks and commando raids became more frequent and sophisticated. Enemy soldiers stationed at coastal installations lived in constant fear of attacks that could come without warning from directions that their defensive preparations could not adequately cover. Japanese military morale suffered severely as reports of successful American submarine operations spread throughout enemy forces. The knowledge that coastal installations were vulnerable to attack by weapons launched from invisible platforms created a sense of helplessness that undermined Japanese fighting effectiveness during the final months of the war. Intelligence reports indicated that some Japanese coastal defense units were requesting transfers to inland positions where they would be safe from submarine attacks, revealing the extent to which American innovations had damaged enemy confidence in their defensive capabilities. These transfer requests created personnel shortages at critical coastal installations, while demonstrating the psychological effectiveness of submarine-launched warfare. The technical evolution of rocket launcher systems continued throughout the final months of the war, as Navy ordnance experts incorporated lessons learned from operational experience into improved designs. New rocket types were developed specifically for submarine launch, featuring enhanced accuracy and explosive power that increased their effectiveness against hardened targets. Fire control systems for submarine rocket launchers became increasingly sophisticated, as crews gained experience with targeting procedures and environmental compensation techniques. These systems incorporated ballistic computers and range-finding equipment that improved accuracy while reducing the time required for targeting calculations. Training programs for submarine rocket attacks were established at Pearl Harbor and other Navy facilities, ensuring that crews could operate the new weapon systems effectively without compromising their traditional P&I. Submarine warfare capabilities. The training emphasized safety procedures and emergency protocols that minimized the risks associated with handling explosive rockets in confined submarine spaces. The development of specialized commando equipment for submarine operations led to innovations in waterproof explosives, silent weapons, and communication gear that enhanced the effectiveness of land-based raids. This equipment was designed specifically for the unique requirements of operations launched from submarine platforms, incorporating features that were not found in conventional military gear. Navigation techniques for commando operations became increasingly precise as crews developed methods for accurately positioning submarines for landing operations while maintaining readiness for emergency escape if enemy forces detected their presence. These techniques required exceptional seamanship and navigation skills that went far beyond traditional submarine operating procedures. The coordination between submarine crews and commando raiding parties required new communication protocols and timing procedures that ensured successful completion of land-based missions while maintaining the security of the submarine. These protocols had to account for the possibility of communication failures and unexpected delays that could compromise the safety of both the raiding party and the submarine crew. Japanese countermeasures against submarine commando raids included increased coastal patrols improved lighting systems, and enhanced guard procedures at vulnerable installations. However, these countermeasures were largely ineffective against well-trained submarine crews who could approach targets underwater and strike without warning before disappearing beneath the waves. The strategic implications of submarine-launched land warfare capabilities became apparent to military planners on both sides of the conflict. American strategists recognized that submarines equipped with rocket launchers and commando capabilities could support amphibious operations and coastal bombardment missions that had previously required large and being surface vessels or aircraft carriers. Japanese military leaders understood that their defensive strategies needed fundamental revision to address threats that could approach from underwater and strike targets that had been considered secure. This recognition led to expensive and time-consuming modifications of coastal defenses that diverted resources from other critical military requirements. The industrial impact of submarine rocket attacks and commando raids extended beyond immediate physical damage to include disruptions in production schedules, transportation systems, and worker morale that affected Japanese military capabilities throughout the final months of the war. Factory workers in coastal areas lived in constant fear of sudden attacks that could come without warning, reducing their productivity and effectiveness. Supply chain disruptions caused by submarine attacks on transportation infrastructure created cascading effects throughout Japanese industry, as factories were forced to operate with reduced raw material, deliveries, and uncertain shipping schedules. These disruptions made it increasingly difficult for Japanese military forces to maintain adequate supplies of ammunition, fuel, and replacement equipment. The technological superiority demonstrated by American submarine innovations reinforced Japanese recognition that they were fighting an enemy whose industrial and technical capabilities far exceeded their own. This recognition contributed to the growing conviction among Japanese leaders that continued resistance was futile, and that surrender represented the only viable option for avoiding complete national destruction. Intelligence-gathering capabilities of submarines conducting rocket attacks and commando raids provided valuable information about Japanese defensive preparations, industrial capabilities, and civilian morale that enhanced Allied understanding of enemy weaknesses. This intelligence was used to plan additional operations and assess the effectiveness of ongoing strategic bombing campaigns. The crew of the USS Barb became celebrities within the American submarine service as news of their innovations spread throughout the Pacific Fleet. Their success inspired other submarine crews to attempt similar modifications and operations, creating a spirit of innovation and experimentation that characterized American submarine warfare during the final phase of the Pacific conflict. Training exchanges between submarine crews allowed the rapid dissemination of tactical knowledge and technical expertise that had been developed through operational experience. These exchanges ensured that innovations pioneered by individual submarines could be quickly adopted throughout the submarine force, multiplying their strategic impact. The legacy of submarine rocket attacks and commando raids extended far beyond World War II, influencing the development of special operations forces and underwater warfare capabilities that became critical components of military strategy during the Cold War and subsequent conflicts. The principles demonstrated by the USS Barb's operations provided foundations for modern naval special warfare that continues to evolve today. Engineering innovations developed for submarine rocket launchers contributed to advances in naval gunnery and missile systems that enhanced the capabilities of surface ships and submarines for decades after the war ended. The technical challenges overcome by the Barb's crew provided valuable experience that influenced the design of future naval weapon systems. The psychological warfare aspects of submarine-launched attacks became important components of military planning, as strategists recognized the value of creating fear and uncertainty among enemy forces and civilian populations. The ability to strike targets that were considered secure demonstrated the importance of maintaining technological and tactical superiority over potential adversaries. Historical analysis of the USS Barb's operations revealed the critical importance of leadership, innovation, and crew morale in achieving exceptional military results. Commander Fluckey's willingness to experiment with unconventional tactics and his crew's enthusiasm for challenging traditional limitations became case studies in military leadership and organizational effectiveness. The technical documentation created during the development and operation of submarine rocket launchers provided valuable data for post-war naval research and development programs. This documentation included detailed engineering drawings, operational procedures, and performance data that influenced the design of future submarine weapon systems. International recognition of American submarine innovations during World War II enhanced the reputation of the United States Navy and contributed to American strategic influence during the post-War period. The demonstration of technological superiority and tactical creativity reinforced perceptions of American military capabilities that influenced diplomatic and strategic relationships for decades. The story of the USS Barb's revolutionary operations represents more than just military innovation. It demonstrates the power of creative thinking, determined leadership, and skilled execution in overcoming seemingly impossible challenges. Commander Fluckey and his crew proved that conventional limitations could be transcended through bold vision and meticulous preparation, establishing principles that continue to inspire military professionals and leaders in all fields. As the war in the Pacific drew to its conclusion in August 1945, the USS Barb had established herself as the most innovative and successful submarine of the conflict. Her rocket attacks and commando raids had not only inflicted significant damage on Japanese military capabilities, but it also demonstrated new forms of warfare that would influence military thinking for generations to come. The legacy of their achievements extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories, creating precedents for underwater warfare that would shape naval strategy throughout the modern era.